Greetings and hello to everyone. This is the Business of Betting podcast, and I'm your host, Jake Williams. Today is episode 44, and we have Brady Kannon joining the show. Brady is a golf handicapper based in Las Vegas and has been following and betting golf tournaments for many years. Brady is also the 2011 LVH NFL Super Contest champion. We chat handicapping a golf tournament, betting markets, and tips for recreational golf bettors to increase their chances of success. This podcast is proudly sponsored by Betfair. Betfair operates a betting exchange and is licensed in the Northern Territory of Australia. Residents of Australia can join Betfair by visiting betfair.com.au and support this podcast by using promo code BOBPOD. Please gamble responsibly. As always, you can find us at businessofbetting.com or at bettingpod on Twitter. Please fire in any questions or feedback and potential guests you would like to hear from. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy my chat with Brady Kannon. Today I'm joined by Brady Kannon. Brady, thank you very much for joining me.
Absolutely, Jake. Good to be here.
So, Brady, we're going to talk about betting on golf and how you handicap and bet golfing events from around the world. But before we get started on that, let's start with some background and information first. You are obviously involved in the business of golf. So how many games of golf do you get to play every year?
Not very many anymore. I'm too busy doing 100 different things, but used to play once every couple of weeks and got down to a pretty good single-digit player, even won the member guest championship at a country club I used to belong to. But since then, I've gotten busier and busier with the golf business and the golf handicapping and all the other things that I'm doing, radio and all that stuff, and having fun with it, but less time spent on the course, unfortunately.
So you run LV Tee Times, that's correct?
Yes, yeah, I work for a company called Tee Times USA, and our local, we do Tee Times around the country and even internationally, but our Las Vegas location and website is lvteetimes.com, yes. And
it would be remiss of me not to mention the NFL season in 2011 when you were the captain of Sans Souci, is that correct? As if I got the pronunciation right there?
Yeah, pretty close. Sans Souci, which in French means no problem.
Oh.
And so we thought that would be kind of a fun title, no problem, no worries, what have you. Technically it means without worry, Sans Souci. We actually got that name from, we're all music fans, and that was a sign above the door to the home of Jerry Garcia, the lead singer for the Grateful Dead, at his home in Marin County near San Francisco. And so we thought that would be kind of a fun team name for us. And yeah, quite an NFL season it was. It turned out to be no problem in the end.
Do you remember what percentage? You guys got the record back then, right?
We did. We had the highest record ever at 72.5%. And at that time, there was the most entries into the contest ever, which was 517. And it was right after that that Jay Cornegay and myself, the vice president of the race and sportsbook there at the Westgate, we put together a Super Contest kickoff weekend. And there have been certainly other factors and even bigger factors to the growth of the Super Contest, but I'd like to believe that the kickoff weekend has contributed to the popularity of the contest as well. I believe this August will be our 7th kickoff weekend now, and we're approaching a field of 3,000 now in the contest. And just 7 years ago, when we won it, we had a record number of 517. So quite a bit of growth, and it's exciting to see.
Wow. I guess that's a whole another episode or another podcast for the NFL. I want to talk about golf today. So I guess from your perspective, what's the very first thing that you'll start with when you sit down to handicap a golf tournament? Do you start with the actual tournament and the venue? Or do you look at, players first? Do you look at the betting market? What's the very first thing you do?
The very first thing I do is I basically set up my grid of stats and my little number cruncher spreadsheet, if you will, and I go through what I believe are going to be the most important skill sets needed to have success at a particular venue, and I'll go back through my years past and see what I thought was important in years past, whether it's, greens in regulation or scrambling or, putting inside of 10 feet, a number of different things that are important week to week, but some courses have particular characteristics that, place more importance on certain areas. And, I think if a player performs well in those certain areas, that can separate them from the pack. So I'll go back and see what areas I looked at in past years, and then I'll check around some various websites and see what other people are talking about, and see if there's maybe something I missed, if there's something new, maybe there's a tweak in the design, maybe they changed the grasses and the greens, or anything that might be different, or maybe something else that appeared successful in the winter the previous year. If all of a sudden they were tremendous on all of the par fours, or if there was a different statistic anyway that maybe stood out among the usual suspects, if you will. And I'll kind of plug those categories into my spreadsheet, and then just start looking at the field and seeing who excels in what areas.
So how do you find or develop that specific information? Do you have to do it yourself, or is there a place you can find that, at Hilton Head, for example, there's a specific type of player who might need to be more sort of versatile and have a bit more finesse in their game, or some of the longer hitting courses like Pebble or Bay Hill? How do you have all that, information before you sit down to handicap?
I have it from years past when I've, written articles and, looked at handicapping certain golf courses in the past. So I have it all documented. And so, like I say, I'll go back to those and just reference, the key areas year in and year out. But then, after that, I'll look around, and there's a number of different websites, maybe half a dozen different websites, where you can kind of look at, how people are previewing these golf tournaments and what they say are important. You can also just go back to the statistics from the past few years or whatever, and look at, what categories guys were excelling in. Like, for instance, if you take a look at, the Honda Classic. Okay, let's go back a few weeks on the Florida swing here and look at the Honda Classic, and look at the last few guys that have won it: Justin Thomas, Ricky Fowler, Padraig Harrington, and go back and find half a dozen things that they were tops in the field in that particular week. And, you can kind of base your handicap from that, and take those 5, 6, 7, 8 skill sets where they led the field or they were in the top 10 in the field. Obviously, if they're doing well in those areas, that indicates to you that, those are areas that indicate success at that particular golf course. And, some golf courses, and you can find a lot of this just even on like PGAtour.com. There's some guys that write some columns on there and stuff, and they'll tell you, last year at the Honda, Ricky Fowler was first in strokes gained putting, or Justin Thomas was number 1 in the field in scrambling. So, you kind of have to use some of your own instinct and some of your own knowledge and what you think is going to be important for the golf course. But as far as finding what ingredients it took to win the past handful of years, that's readily available online.
So tell me about weather. What impact does weather play when you're evaluating a tournament? So whether it's, in the middle of the desert in the US, whether it's St. Andrews, it might be a bit more windy or a bit cooler, and if it's rained all week at a venue and the greens might be a bit softer. Is weather a huge impact, or is it a minor element that goes into the overall handicap?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, it can certainly be huge, but it's difficult to base your handicap on weather necessarily, because, there are maybe a few players that you figure are going to be better in certain conditions than others. But, generally, the field is all playing in those same conditions, whatever they are. So you kind of don't change, or at least I don't change my handicap significantly. One player is still going to do what he does traditionally over 4 days, no matter what, really. Now, there are better players and certain ball flights, and, guys on the European tour are typically playing in more wet and rainy and windy events than guys in the U.S. So, there's certainly some adjustments in that regard that you have to make. There are guys that are better players in wind than others. Australians, like you, Jake, typically play very well in the wind because they grew up with that type of thing. Charlie Hoffman has talked about being a very good player in the wind because he played at UNLV in Las Vegas. And here in the springtime in Las Vegas, we get a lot of wind. So Charlie's a player that had to figure out how to play in the wind. Ricky Fowler, they talk about as being a good player in the wind. Tom Watson, unfortunately, he's no longer really involved in too many handicaps anymore, but probably one of the greatest wind players ever. So, and then, the other thing where it really comes into play is when you have a tournament where it's supposed to really blow or really rain or whatever it's going to do on a Thursday and a Friday, and then you look at the draw and who's going to catch the worst and the best of the weather. Now that's where it really, becomes a big factor. But other than that, it's tough because you just kind of have to, try and figure out, well, who's good in these type of conditions. And, there's not really stats for that, if you will.
Yeah. So tee times, tell me about that. Is that randomized, I guess, for the first 2 days of a tournament? We're talking about weather. If it's going to be blowing a gale in the afternoon, for example, and you're teeing off at the 8 a.m. tee off, are those types of things factored into the marketplace? Are they thought about? Obviously, I'm sure the professionals do, but just generally in even head-to-head betting, which we'll hopefully talk about soon, if someone's teeing off at 9 a.m. and for some reason their opponent in a head-to-head betting market is midday, are those things fully understood, do you think?
I don't think they always are, because I've been able to take advantage of that on a few occasions. The head-to-head and the individual round matchups, those are usually done with a player that is playing against another player in that same pairing. So they're obviously going to be teeing off at the same time. But yeah, if you're looking at, a full tournament matchup over the course of the 4 rounds, and you've got one guy, like you say, that's teeing off at 8 a.m. and one guy that's teeing off at 1 p.m., there certainly may be a distinct advantage. And, I think eventually you see the price catch up, but oftentimes I've, seen it before the price has been adjusted. And I've seen it work both ways. You really think you've got an advantage, and it doesn't always turn out.
Yeah,
but,
of course.
I remember, I think it was the LA Open or the Genesis Open last year. They really had some weather there last year, and I think it worked out nearly 100% of playing guys that were in the morning on Thursday and in the afternoon on Friday or something like that. I can't remember, but the rain, it was very distinct as far as, in comparison to the draw, the morning and the afternoon tee times. The weather was like just fine for these guys and just horrific for these guys. And it worked out nearly 100%, I believe, in all the matchups we played that particular week.
The Betfair Exchange isn't a house that sets the odds. It's betting at its purest. One punter's opinion against another's. Play the game within the game at betfair.com.au. Gamble responsibly.
So let's talk about an individual player now. How much do you value recent form or current form, let's say, versus sort of their season-long performance or even annual performance? Do you weight those depending on the player? Or, obviously someone like Phil Mickelson, for example, might play very well at the Masters every year and be terrible leading up and you can discard it. But sort of in general, when you're looking at a player's recent form, for example, versus season-long.
Well, when they're in really good recent form, a lot of times it's factored into the price, and sometimes you can find value on the underdog, per se, in a matchup like that. But yeah, you have to take into account guys that are going well. It's a little bit different, like in, let's say, the NFL, where you get a team that's on a 3 or 4 game winning streak, and let's say, the New York Jets, and they just on that, third or fourth game of the winning streak, they just upset the Patriots. They had a big upset or whatever. And, the common NFL handicap is going into the following week, you would expect them to come back down to earth a little bit and let down a little bit after, knocking off Goliath like the Patriots. In golf, it seems to be not exactly the same. If you get a guy that is really rolling along and let's say wins a big tournament, oftentimes they do not let down the following week. They continue that momentum and playing well. So it's tough to figure out sometimes whether you want to go against a guy that's having, success, or if you want to continue to ride that streak. I think it just comes down to the individual player. Oftentimes if you get a first-time winner on tour, it's their very first victory, and they've got stars in their eyes after they win this prize. Oftentimes those guys do come back down to earth the next week. But, I think generally when you're dealing with the veterans, or the top players in the world, if they're going along well, they tend to continue to do that. You have to take that into consideration. I do think it's figured into the price as well. And then, a lot of times there's value, like you say, Jake, on the guys that are just kind of cruising along and doing well over the course of a season, not necessarily, on fire over the last 2 or 3 weeks, but just steady, like Zach Johnson this week. He hadn't missed a cut since last August, and he's done well in match play. And I thought, here's a guy that's basically the biggest underdog on the board to win this match play tournament, and the guy's been doing just fine, under the radar albeit, but he's had a lot of top 20 finishes, hasn't missed a cut in a long, long time, has done well at match play. So sometimes there's guys that are playing consistent over the course of time that you can find value on as well.
So how highly would you value past performance at a specific course, for example? And I know you probably need to balance it with, I guess, luck and randomness. If it's just, let's say, their first time and they win an event and they've got 4 rounds essentially on the record or 72 holes total, do you value that highly, or does it need to fit in with your, like you mentioned before, you would pick the characteristics of the course and the player and see if they match?
Yeah, they have to match, certainly. You can sometimes have an anomaly like Gary Woodland winning at the Valspar Championship. The Valspar is typically won by a ball striker and a plotter and the guy that can work the ball around corners and not a bomber. And Gary Woodland is a bomber, so that one was a little bit of an anomaly that particular year. But like Henrik Stenson at Bay Hill has just been a warrior out there at that course. He just seems to do well every single year in and year out. And, he did again this year. So, he just seems to be a no-brainer for that tournament year in and year out. I used to play in some like fantasy golf things where you'd have to pick a winner for each tournament before the season started. And you mentioned Mickelson at Augusta. He was the guy you always slotted in for the Masters because he had more top tens there than God knows who else, And so, there certainly are horses for courses. Stenson at Bay Hill, Mickelson at the Masters. Jim Furyk used to be exceptionally good at, some of the old Buick tournaments that they had. And there were guys that, were just like clockwork that you could just plug into certain tournaments for sure.
So golf handicapping seems to be largely situational in many respects, but also nowadays you see the analytical side of other sports. And I guess from your perspective, can you dig deep into the numbers and the putting metrics, the greens in regulation metrics, and utilize, like you mentioned before, your spreadsheets and these type of things to create sort of player characteristics? Or do you still need to know and understand the players, where they're from, where they went to college, what the weather and the courses are like, where they grew up?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Jake. And I really believe my school of thought is I think you have to take into account all of that. That can be a lot of information to scour through, but sometimes you can find some little gems in there that make a lot of sense. Thomas Pieters, for instance, winning the amateur championship at Riviera Country Club. So a lot of people didn't know that he was familiar with that course, and it was last year at the Genesis. I think he finished second or fourth or something like that because he had some history there from his college days at Illinois. Now, some people will just purely look at the numbers, and I have some friends in the business that don't pay attention to a whole lot else and just strictly go with the numbers and are very successful at it. I kind of fall in the middle, I guess, of the generation gap where half of me is into the new numbers and the analytics and that side of things, and the older half of me is into the old school handicapping of digging up information and, like you say, where they're from, where they grew up. The guys from South Africa grew up with kikuyu grass, and the guys from California grew up with poana, and Florida, Bermuda, and where they went to college and are they experienced in match play. So I think I'm kind of fortunate where I'm a student of both the old and the new regime, if you will.
So, Brady, betting on a golf tournament, how far in advance do you start thinking about a betting plan or an approach when something like a major? Are you thinking months in advance and maybe placing a few futures bets and knowing what's coming up, you can sort of predict how the market might swing, or are you looking at it 2 or 3 days in advance of the first round and strictly betting sort of closer to post time, let's call it?
Well, certainly the Masters, and probably more so than any tournament, on the entire schedule in the entire world. The Masters I start thinking about way in advance because it's the same course every year. The characteristics and what is needed to do well at the course don't change much. They have changed from kind of the pre-Tiger Masters to the post-Tiger Masters. They Tiger-proofed the course, and different factors have come into play. Obviously, it's a longer course, but it really used to just be one way, and now it's one way plus a few other ways. But because not much has changed over the years, and they play the same venue year in and year out, the Masters is certainly a tournament that I'll start thinking about. I remember I made my first future play for this year's Masters last September. So the Masters is always one that is at the forefront of your mind a long way in advance. As far as the other tournaments week to week, yes, they play oftentimes at the very same venue, and I know what characteristics it's going to take, but you kind of have to just take what the market is going to give you, and it's hard to think in advance. I mean, is Dustin Johnson going to win the LA Open again? Is Dustin Johnson going to win at Pebble Beach again? There's these guys that do well. Henrik Stenson at Bay Hill we talked about, but thinking that far in advance for a tournament like that, I think is different than the Masters because you don't know what these guys are going to be like going in. You don't know how they're going to be playing. You don't know if they're even going to show up at the tournament this year. So as far as the regular tour events, I pretty much just go week to week. I might start thinking about something on a Sunday as they're finishing up with one tournament and heading into the next week. I'll start thinking about some things, and then I really start diving into it on Monday. And then, as far as the other majors, the British Open is one that you can look at a little bit because you are familiar with, typically a course that is in the Rota. But, for the most part, it's really just the Masters that I think you can really start looking at well in advance.
So there's sort of certain principles in sports betting that usually work well across different sports, and one of them is betting futures, given the market percentage in those markets are often heavily tilted towards the bookmakers. Is golf a little bit different just because of the way it's sort of constructed with so many players? And I guess the favorites sometimes can be 8, 9, 10, 11 to 1. Is it something that can be profitable just because of the way golf is set up? And if you're betting well in advance on, even if it's 4 or 5 tournaments a year, you can still find those outliers in those markets and bet accordingly?
Yeah, Jake, it kind of depends on where you're shopping, from store to store. You're right. There are certain books that are very shaded towards the house and you're just never really able to get a good number. And then there's others that have what appear to be very fair odds. And if you're handicapping a football game, you might say, okay, I think New England should be favored by 3 points. And if you're talking about golf, where we are right now, you might say the true odds on Tiger are 20 to 25 to 1 to win the Masters. And and my book has him at 10-1. So obviously in your mind, that's not good value. But I do believe, probably like with anything, Jake, the further you are out in front of it, the more likely you are to get good value. And obviously that's difficult because you have to be a little bit predictive and have a little bit of a crystal ball, if you will. And I mean, you could have gotten Paul Casey at 40 or 50-1 to win the Masters, and then he wins the Valspar, and now he's 20 or 25-1. So obviously, if you have that crystal ball, and you didn't need an incredible crystal ball with Casey. He's done well at the Masters year in and year out the past 4 or 5 years, so he's been very successful there. So if you wanted to take a shot at him prior to that win, you obviously got a better number. And I've done that before too, where I might, see a guy that is heading into Saturday and getting out in front of the field by 3 or 4 shots. And I'll say, okay, this guy's going to win this tournament. I'm going to bet him now to win the U.S. Open, because after he wins this week, his odds are going to plummet.
Yeah.
So I've done that before too. But I think the general rule is 2 things. If you see value at one store where he's trading at 80-1 and every other store's got him at 50-1, then, you jump on that 80. Or again, the other thing is the further out in advance you can see something happening, the better off you are typically. Now, I bet Daniel Berger at what I thought was a good number to win the Masters at 75-1, and now he's kind of gone the other way, and he's as high as 125-1. So, sometimes it comes back to you to bite you the other way too.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do you approach just day-to-day or week-to-week betting on golf events? And I guess, like I mentioned, you can have an 8-1 favorite. That's relatively normal when you're talking about golf. Do you have to spread out your bets over 2, 3, 4 players, or are you thinking about 7 to 10 different bets? Because obviously if it's a 40-1 chance, it could lose 35 times in a row, and that wouldn't be sort of unusual from a betting perspective. So how do you attack a golf tournament before it starts?
Well, honestly, Jake, I don't bet a ton of futures, and I'll just do the futures very recreationally. Now, I'll get involved more seriously and with more of a strategy for the 4 majors. But week to week, I really don't get involved in too many future plays. It's just such a long shot. And it's almost like betting parlays. If you hit 1 out of, but you still got to hit that 1 out of every 6 or 7. I think it's easier. You certainly see, I think, more consistent results anyway, betting the head-to-head matchups. So that's what I do week in and week out. And, all of the research that I do and all of the articles that I write, I do come up with a few guys that I think can win the golf tournament, and I will kind of spread out a few pennies across those guys just for fun, more or less. And I've hit a few, certainly. But again, I get more serious about playing the futures with the majors, and I do take an approach where I'll do a certain percentage of a unit and a small percentage, and it'll be correlated to that player's odds. The higher the odds, the less money I'll risk. The lower the odds, the more money I might put on them. But, whereas on a matchup, if I'm betting a unit or even a half a unit or a unit and a half, a future bet, I might be betting 5 or 10% of a unit. So and it's the same way I would treat a parlay in a football game. I call them lottery tickets. I might fill out a parlay ticket for $5 and hope I hit the lottery, but my real bet might be on a single game. And I think it's the same with golf as far as the argument of betting futures versus head-to-head matchups.
Yeah, and I want to talk about head-to-head in a second. One last question on the futures side. There's a particular golfer called Eldrick Woods who, during his peak time, and maybe he's coming back to some form now, but back in his peak, he was 2, 3, 4-1 for some of these tournaments. Was the futures betting much different back then when Tiger was playing, because of the rest of the field might have had potentially there might have been more value throughout it because it was so shaded towards the public and average bettors?
Yeah, that goes a ways back before I was paying attention to it so closely. And I remember Tiger was, I mean, if you saw Tiger at 2-1 to win a major, that was a good price. I mean,
Yeah, it's amazing.
He was for the most part even money or even minus money, to win these things, and he won them so regularly. I mean, his percentage on winning not only majors but golf tournaments was unprecedented. So, the odds maker had to. I mean, you never saw Tiger at 10-1. He like I say, even money, 2-1. But yeah. That of course would say that there's value in the rest of the field, but Tiger won so often, you have to pick your spots. When are you going to hit that other guy that wins, and who's that other guy going to be? It might be easier now where you have 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 guys that can win every week, and you've got better numbers.
Yeah. Okay.
One thing that I know that's been created for sure recently is, all this love for Tiger in the recent events, the Honda Classic, the Valspar, the Bay Hill, the Masters, with his odds plummeting by the hour, it seems, by the shot, if you will. There is certainly being value created on the other guys. And it's different because, in year 2000, Tiger was clearly the favorite. He was dominant, and you just didn't know if the other guys were going to win. Tiger no longer currently is that dominant. And there's 30 or 40 or 50 other guys that are just as good, if not a lot better than him. So while Tiger's odds continue to go down, the odds on guys like Justin Rose and Phil Mickelson and Paul Casey continue to rise. And I think that's where you're able to get some value these days. While everybody's focused in on Tiger, take a look at these other guys, and while their numbers are going up.
So let's talk about head-to-head betting. Obviously, and generally in sporting events, you have two teams or players against each other. Golf's a little bit different in that, the odds maker and the bookmakers create the head-to-head matchups, and they may be in the same grouping or pairing, but quite often, unless it's match play, they're going to be trying to win the tournament, I suppose, rather than beat their, opponent in that group. So what are some of the factors that are important to consider when talking about betting head-to-head golf matchups?
Yeah, what I like about it, Jake, is, different from the futures market where you're trying to basically just look at value and pick, a needle in a haystack, really, one guy to win the golf tournament out of 150. A head-to-head matchup, as you say, it is like betting, the Patriots against the Steelers, and you're going to handicap that team and what they're good at, and where they may be able to expose the other team's weaknesses and whatnot. It's very similar with a golf head-to-head matchup. You're going to look at that player and how you figure he's going to do at this course this particular week versus that other player and what he may or may not do and their strengths and weaknesses. So I think it's more crunchable, if you will. There's more data that you can sink your teeth into on player A versus player B than trying to, again, pick one player out of a field that's going to beat everybody else. A more concrete handicap, I guess, if it would be the way to say it.
And how has the betting markets for golf evolved, I guess, over the last sort of 5 or 6 years maybe? Is there a lot more prop betting popping up, like, total amount of putts or greens in regulations hit or things like that? Or is it still pretty standard betting markets that you'll find?
I think I'm seeing pretty much the standard stuff, but what I am seeing is those props being offered more regularly and for more smaller tournaments, not just the majors. The majors always have the props that go along with them, but I'm starting to see the props pop up on week-to-week events as well. And I think it just is, a credit to the rise in golf betting and the popularity of golf betting, and the odds makers are offering more opportunities and more ways to bet it. And again, on a more weekly basis than what they were doing in the past. And really, you can say that golf betting has become more popular, certainly, but it's also the Tiger effect. He's bringing more people to the window. He's bringing more people to their TV set. And, all of that just creates opportunities for the bettor and the bookmaker. And it's all good. It makes it all fun.
Yeah, absolutely. So this might be a weird question, but in terms of winning a golf tournament, what role does luck play, or I guess randomness? Is it something that is a big impact? And you've obviously lived and breathed golf your whole life. You've played a lot. You've watched these tournaments, watched these players, know them in detail. Is luck a critical factor in all this?
Yeah, I think that's probably true in any sport. You can handicap your rear end off, but at the end of the day, there's going to be a little bit of luck involved, and we're human beings, and so there's certainly some of that as well. I mean, last week, or I guess last week at Bay Hill, I had Justin Rose to win the golf tournament, and I thought he looked like a real good bet to come through on Sunday. And then all of a sudden, Rory McIlroy goes nuts, and he's 8 under par through his final 13 holes, and he's pulling every putt he looks at. I mean, that doesn't happen all the time. And then he goes into this week and doesn't maintain that level of play, which I didn't think he would. And he's out before the knockout stage of the match play. So yeah, random things happen. Like I say, in any sport, Fred Couples' ball hanging on the edge of the grass there at 12 at Augusta, and he goes on to win that tournament. So, you do your best. It's kind of like Tiger says, if you execute the shot that you wanted to hit, where it lands is not up to you. You did your part. Where what if it hits a sprinkler head? There's weird stuff that happens, but all you can do is, if you have handicapped Alex Noren to win the match play or whatever, well, so far you're doing pretty well, but eventually it's going to probably be left up to the golf gods as well.
So in your opinion or in your experience, how efficient do you think the golf markets are, and even the head-to-heads or the futures, all that type of stuff? Is it, let's talk on a scale of NFL being incredibly efficient, and there's betting going on around the world, and those numbers are pretty sharp. Is golf at that end of the scale, or is it much more at the other end of the scale, and it's not necessarily a saturated or mature market yet, and it'll take some time before it gets anywhere near the likes of NFL matches and NBA matches?
Yeah, I think the latter part of your question there is definitely true. The golf market, it's getting better, but there are certainly holes in the golf betting market, and especially opposed to the NFL, which is extremely efficient and tight. The golf markets are random too. There are certainly some stores that are much sharper than others, and other stores that can be taken advantage of. And I don't think there's not a lot of golf bettors out there that are really moving markets either. There are a few, and you'll see those odds move fast and in big quantity. But if you can get to them on time, I think the golf market is much more vulnerable than, say, an NFL market or an NBA. It has a ways to go because, again, like we talk about, golf betting is just becoming more and more popular. And even 5 years ago, it seems like nobody was betting golf, and a few people there, a few professionals, and making a wager on who's going to win the Masters. But it has really come a long way since then. You and I are sitting here talking about it, and that didn't happen 5 years ago. So they're becoming more efficient, but I still believe they are vulnerable, especially store to store.
With that, then, let's talk about helping, I guess, people that would play golf on the weekends, who enjoy watching some golf, who probably grew up watching Tiger and may be interested in betting. Helping those type of people who might be more focused on other sports, what are some of the, I guess, key statistics that they can look at to get a bit of an insight? Let's say they're the 5-minute handicapper. Would you suggest they look at, greens in regulation, putting, distance of drives, that type of stuff? Or what should they focus on if they've got a limited amount of time to try and improve from a 48, 49% winning golf bettor to maybe get to 51%?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jake. And I would, like you say, if you have limited time and you're thinking about, playing next week's Houston Open or something like that, probably the first thing I would do is go back and just look at who has done well at the Houston Open over the last 5 years. And you say, geez, this guy so-and-so has finished in the top 20, 4 out of the last 5 years. And let's see what he's done the last couple weeks. What's his current form? How's he? Oh, geez, okay, he's doing well. Boy, that guy looks pretty good. Maybe I'll bet him in a matchup. Maybe I'll take a shot on a future. But I would probably first and foremost look at course form and current form, and that kind of gives you probably your foundation, if you will, idea of this guy or these handful of players and how they do at this course and how they're playing currently. And then if you've got a few more minutes, you might dive into some stats and see, well, how are they putting this year? Greens in regulation is probably the most indicative statistic of winning on the PGA Tour over any. I don't think there's a single golf tournament out there that you can't include greens in regulation in. So maybe you dive in to the stats a little bit. How's he putting? How's he doing? How's his accuracy off the tee? And kind of throw that all into a basket and see what you come up with. But that would probably be a superficial look that I would recommend.
So in line with that, is there a most overrated factor that an average golf fan uses or thinks valuable? And I don't have one necessarily off the top of my head. Maybe that a player missed the cut last week at a tournament, and therefore this week they're more likely to miss the cut than they should be. Is there anything that stands out that falls within the public narrative when the average bettor is thinking about placing a $5, $10, or a $20 bet that you could sort of say, look, this is probably not the best indicator?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's hard to think of something. I was speaking earlier in the podcast here about in an NFL game, oftentimes you can fade a team the week after they've done something really excellent, something maybe above their heads, and you expect them to kind of fall back a little bit. And in golf betting, you might see Patton Kazire win a golf tournament, and you expect he's going to come back down to earth the next week, and it doesn't always happen. He often goes out and wins again. So sometimes things that you expect traditional handicapping methods don't seem to always be true in golf. I would just say, like in any sport, really, just be careful of the price on the favorites. You're paying a premium for guys like Tiger Woods and Dustin Johnson, and if you look at the Masters and how good these players are today, I really don't think anybody should be favored or have odds of less than 10-1 to win that tournament, because it's that wide open. And so I think it might be a little bit of a mistake for a recreational bettor to just go out there and blindly bet Tiger at 6-1 or whatever, because that's not really good value. So it's a tough question to answer, Jake. I don't know if there are red flags that come up off the top of my head, but maybe I've given you a little bit of insight there anyway.
Yeah, definitely.
Let's talk price. Unlike bookies and toads, the Betfair Exchange is a low-margin, buy-sell, fixed-odds marketplace where the value stays with the punter, not the house. Ready for the game within the game? Join betfair.com.au. Gamble responsibly.
What type of golf content do you listen to, read, consume? How do you get all your information? What are some of the best spots you can push people towards to get more information?
Yeah, I write a column that comes out every Wednesday, so I certainly encourage people to find those. You can find it on covers.com and sportsbookreview.com. I also write a piece for Point Spread Weekly, which is a subscription publication for the radio network VEASAN. That's the Vegas Stats and Information Network. And then I also really respect the guys that work at Betfair, which is over in the UK, Steve Rawlings and Dave Tyndall, and there's another couple of writers over there that their names are escaping me. There's a podcast. Gosh, I can't remember that. I want to say it's like Dave Kendall. But there's some guys that he's with William Hill, I believe, in the UK. But there's some guys that do some stuff overseas that are tremendous. They really write some great stuff, and they have very good information from a betting angle. It's not necessarily just a preview of the golf tournament, but they'll relate it to betting as well. So I look at what all those guys have to say and kind of take my own information as well, and let that sink in and go from there.
Yeah, Betfair, they're supporters of this podcast as well, and there's a lot of great content coming from Europe and the UK especially. So absolutely, I do listen to some of those, admittedly probably only before the US Open and St. Andrews and obviously Augusta, but yeah, there's some great shows out there. So I guess before I let you go, I must ask that with the Masters coming up, and we're recording I guess, just over a week out. What are some of your predictions? And not necessarily who's going to win, because as we've sort of discussed, it's not that simple to find an outright winner. But are you thinking that it'll be pretty tight at the top? It'll be high scoring, low scoring? Do you expect some of the young guns to pop up? What are some of your expectations coming into the Masters about a week out?
Yeah, one of my favorite topics to talk about, and I have to go back. I remembered it's Dave Kellner in the answer to your last question. Dave Kellner does a podcast. He's with William Hill, UK, and then, of course, Dave Tyndall and Steve Rawlings. Those guys are all excellent. They do a lot of work together, but really good information. And I've spoken with Dave Tyndall a number of times, and Kellner, really good guys as well. But as far as the Masters, it seems like I'm saying this all the time, but I think it may be more so true this year than I can recall in recent past. And that is the fact that I think this year, if you're ever going to go to the event, or if you're ever going to watch it for the first time or whatever, this could be the most amazing year in a while. I think the golfers that we have in the game right now are so unbelievable. And now you've got Tiger in the mix as well. And Tiger certainly appears to be somebody that will contend. Again, I mentioned his odds to win it his true odds are probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 25 to 1, but that's not too much of a long shot. I would expect him to be in the mix. He knows this course awful well, obviously, and he's playing very well. So I think it's going to be great theater to watch Tiger. And then, besides Tiger, there's about another 20 guys that are absolutely incredible, named Jordan Spieth, Justin Rose, Dustin Johnson, Rory McIlroy, Jason Day. The list just goes on. And it just should be absolutely incredible, I think, to watch Augusta this year. As far as low scores and high scores, I haven't looked out at the forecast just yet for what kind of weather we're going to have. Last year we had a ton of wind on the first 2 days, and that really wreaked some havoc on some guys. I think if the weather's decent, we could probably see some low scores, because I just think players are that good right now. Look at Justin Thomas. He is just destroying golf courses. So it ought to be exciting no matter what the scores are, because I think you're going to have just a star-studded leaderboard. And if the weather is calm, I think you're going to have guys going pretty low.
So there's a lot of Aussie listeners to this, and they'll know Adam Scott, they'll know Jason Day and co. Are there any others from sort of the Australian contingent that you can sort of give a little bit of a thumbs up to? I don't know, Mark Leishman, some of these other guys that aren't necessarily as well known?
Well, I tell you, Cameron Smith is pretty awesome. He's fared quite well in the match play this week, and I really like that young kid. But I mentioned earlier in the podcast, Jake, that I made my first Masters future back in September of 2017. And that was actually on Mark Leishman, and I was able to get him at 80 to 1. And he's much lower now at about 40 to 1, or maybe even some 60s still out there. But he has come down a lot. And I made that play on Leishman. He had won at Bay Hill last year. So that was good to win a tour event and get that confidence. He played in the President's Cup as well this year, and a lot of times that international President's Cup, that will be one of the building blocks that you have to get through before you get a major championship. And also, when he won the BMW last year in September as a part of the FedEx Playoff Series, he held off some of the best players in the world. And to see him do that, he won that tournament wire to wire. And to see him do that, that gave me the confidence that this guy has the potential to go on and win a major. He's come that close at the British Open. He's been close at Augusta before. I think he's knocking on the door, and I felt 80 to 1 was a pretty good price. I also like Adam Scott. This guy has quietly been playing very good golf this year statistically. Has had some decent finishes, but statistically he is very much in the mix. So there's a couple of backings that I'm going to be doing as far as the Australians.
Brady, I really appreciate your time. I'm sure a few listeners will be cheering on Mark and Adam and a few other Aussies as well. So certainly there's some, aligned thoughts and feelings there. So good luck with all your bets in the match play, in the Masters. It's a good time of year to be a golf fan and having a few bets. So I really appreciate your insights for the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely, Jake. It was great talking to you, and please feel free to holler at me anytime because I enjoy talking about this stuff.
Awesome. Residents of Australia can join Betfair by visiting betfair.com.au, and please support this podcast by using promo code BOBPOD. Gamble responsibly.